again, we're about to discuss a lot of different technologies, and I hate buzzwords, as you might also hate them. So let's try to go behind and beyond them and try to really understand what type of technologies you're actually using to shoot and to fill in your projects. So maybe let's start with you, Rana. At IBM, you're definitely working on predictive analytics for refugees. What type of technologies are you really using to solve this problem?
Sure. So it'll be really easy for me to dumb this down because I am not a technologist, although I've been told I should stop saying that. But we are using machine learning. We're using statistical analysis. We are using some probability network correlations, and it's unique because we're using also a family of models. So I should probably maybe describe a little bit of what we're doing at a higher level, and that is we want to forecast a refugee crisis. We want to do a better job of using data to forecast refugee arrivals so that we can enable agencies and humanitarian aid organizations to respond proactively. And we know that the humanitarian actors and government workers do a lot of this forecasting work intuitively because they've devoted their careers to these issues, and so they kind of understand how this works. So we asked ourselves, can we put some data behind this and some data science and really give it some legs? And so those are those are some of the technologies that we've been using in AI on a family of models working at the global, regional, and local levels. And then, as I mentioned, some other analytics tools to help us look for those correlations within networks.
And of course, the question is always about the reason why you're going to use those type of technology to solve what type of problem. So if we're looking at our systems with you, John, you're based in Istanbul. What type of problems are you trying to solve, and with which technologies, which tools?
So the most recent publicly known project that we worked on was a system in Syria to warn civilians in advance of airstrikes by observing threatening aircraft in flight, and predicting where they were going to go next and when they might get there. And a relatively complex problem that we use a wide range of tools to try and solve. Everything from, on the AI side, convolutional neural networks to separate signal from noise that's collected by hardware sensors, to language agnostic natural language processing, essentially teaching a computer how to read open media in real time and extract things that we care about out of it, and so that we can make decisions about when and where something might have happened, to path prediction. So if we see something here, here, and here, using machine learning to figure out where that might go next.
Speaking of data, though, I'm going to turn to you, Emmanuel, with the Data Pop Alliance. And of course, it's you're working with the MIT on this very project. Why data, and why big data when it comes to the specific questions, again, you're trying to solve here?
Sure. Bonsoir. Bonjour. So I mean, I'm not a like hardcore data scientist either. I'm not a computer scientist. I have a background in development economics and demography, and I got interested, and I worked for the UN and for the French government in Vietnam, etc. So that's more like the field I come from. I got interested in big data in the very early years, so about like 2010, so like by chance or accident. And I found it fascinating. So the way I usually talk about our work is that I'm trying to think and work on the applications and implications of big data for development, humanitarian action, etc. And I don't consider big data just as the data itself, but as more like the ecosystem of like the data, the human capacities, the political economy, the communities, the culture, etc. So that's for like the general sort of like conceptual context. but also, so when it comes to, so being also a demographer, I have a pretty strong interest in migration. I worked on conflict countries in the past. So of course, when it seems like a clash, so the previous discussion was ended on the, so like, yeah, the dark side and the fears, etc. So for instance, recently we organized a challenge, a data challenge called the Data for Refugee Challenge with MIT and other organizations. So using or providing access to anonymized, aggregated cell phone data from Syrian refugees in Turkey. So it sounds very contentious, and we thought we would get a lot of bad press, and we were like ready for it. We didn't get a lot of bad press. We got some pretty like positive press. So it's, and then I can explain what we're trying to do and what the research teams that got access to these data sets were trying to understand in terms of like integration patterns, in terms of mobility patterns, etc. The kinds of insights you can glean from those data sets. So that's one kind of example. And now we're also working on a project in Colombia, so looking at the effect, the labor market effect of Venezuelans arriving in Colombia and other countries through analysis of cell phone data, of open data from Facebook, but also like standard statistics, like primary data collection surveys. So that's also on the research side.
So that's a lot of different data batch you have to collect and put together and put into context and everything. So how do you, on the very ground level, actually access those data? Can at some point refugees be what I would call human sensors so they can actually get access to the data?
So there are open data. And some of Facebook data are open data, like Twitter are more like open data. Geospatial data can be open data. And then there are statistics, etc. The hardest kinds of data to get access to are the so-called like private sector data. So let's take the example of call detail records, so CDRs, which are collected by private companies, telecom companies for billing purposes. So these have been the sort of like crude oil of big data over the past couple of years because they contain a lot of information like network information, etc. And you can infer gender from like the aggregate level. You can infer income levels from like the way you use your cell phone. So it's been going on for like about 10 years. There are two main models or three main models for accessing those data sets. One is you have a contract with a company. And so you're MIT or some other, and then you get access to the data, it's anonymized, and then you do your survey, and then you destroy the data. So it's also like the old way. And then you can also do data challenges like the one I was describing. The new way, I think, is something, so the OPAL project, which stands for Open Algorithms, so which I think it's the future. It's where you only share or send open algorithms to query private sector data directly on the servers of the companies. And the data do never leave the servers of the company, so they're never exposed. And the only thing that gets out are aggregated statistics. So you ask questions about population density, about metrics, features on the data. So I think that's the model for the future that we're trying to build right now.
So there's a lot of different angles in what you just told us. Of course, there's the notion of privacy, but there's also the question of cybersecurity and the question of regulatory frameworks. And so I guess, and I bet you have to be GDPR compliant. How do you achieve such a regulatory challenge?
So a system like OPAL is yes, completely GDPR compliant. It's actually like above like GDPR like compliance. And I could go at length about like what GDPR covers and does not cover, like about statistics and historical research, etc. But so the only thing that is extracted are aggregated indicators, and so there are different steps. It's all the queries are logged also on the blockchain, so that you can see who had access and you get credentials. And so we're not opening the platform to anyone. The core notion is one of consent. I think the discussion around property rights is misguided in many ways. It's not a question of property rights, it's a question of control. Who has control over the data? But that's a longer discussion.
Rana and John, did you have such challenge to face actually while collecting data or while trying to use those proper technologies to, again, the question you're trying to solve for the sake of refugees?
I mean, we face a host of privacy issues with the work that we're doing. We take voluntary observations from human beings, which we pseudonymize to ensure that we're not storing any information, any PII, personally identifying information about those folks. We also have hardware sensors, and the tricky thing about hardware sensors, for anyone who has an Amazon Echo in their home, is their listening devices, essentially. And there's, you know, even in a war zone, or especially in a war zone, there are serious concerns about having a listening device anywhere near you. And we took an approach to essentially only keep the things that are absolutely relevant to making a decision about a threat, and anything else is dropped on the floor. It's not stored locally on the device, and it's not sent to any servers. So we try to remain extremely laser focused as we collect data to make sure that it's absolutely necessary to solve the problem that we're there to solve.
Rana?
Yeah, and we've taken a similar approach. We don't use any sensitive personal information. We are doing our analyses based on a lot of publicly available data, and so we've been similarly cautious.
And yet, is there a technology that fits all questions or solutions you're trying to reach to, or is there more of a tailor-made type of approach where you have to really mix and match the technologies with, again, the question and solutions?
This gets to the difficulty I have when actually describing what kind of company we are. I mean, it's a lot easier if I could say we're a hardware sensor company, or we're a sentiment analysis company. The fact is, at Hala, we're trying to kind of approach some pretty weird problem sets that are relatively complex. If we approach those with a predisposed notion of a particular tool or a particular technology, there's a high likelihood we'll just fail. And so we end up building this kind of incredibly broad tool set. I haven't found a single technology to solve even one problem that we face, and I don't think it's going to change for us in the future.
Emmanuel.
So I think there is not one technology. It's not blockchain, or it's not. But I think there are core principles. So there are core ethical principles. So for instance, one set of standards that I think are very useful are the ones of the Menlo report that was developed for ICT research, and there are 4 core principles about beneficence, and so things like fairness, respect for law, etc. And they also get into things like empowerment, participation, informed consent, etc. There are also more specific principles that we try to abide by and foster and reflect in our work around things like never share PII. So data, and increasingly a core principle is to put the computation out. So that means you do not share the data. You do not create major databases. You do not create data lakes or data pools or data whatnot. You don't do that. So you don't try to create metabases and so the data never leave the servers of the institution that has the strongest incentive to protect it for reputational reasons, if anything, and commercial reasons. So in the case of very private sensitive data like telecom data, banking data, financial data, these data sets should stay on the servers of these companies, and then you have to find ways to query them. And this is where you get more into more technical aspects or considerations and modalities, but that are informed by those ethical principles. And research about the limits of re-identification or the limits of privacy, which has been a pretty big strand of research over the past 5 years, including by people involved in the OPAL project at MIT and the Imperial College.
So again, thinking out of the box, what type of application can we think about while trying to mix and match AI, blockchain, big data, all those type of technologies? Authentication for identities, I guess. We can also think about disseminating true and correct information to the dedicated populations, or modelizing population flows. Which specific directions or focuses are you trying to employ those technologies for?
So first of all, just to agree, on the tailor-made solution, migration is such an inherently complex issue. And with our proof of concept that we developed, we did something very different than what we're doing in our partnership with the Danish Refugee Council right now, in which we are really analyzing the drivers of a migration, mixed migration, right? What motivates somebody to leave, forcibly displaced or otherwise. So to answer your immediate question, the applications, I just think there's so much more, so many more things that we could be doing better. I think first and foremost, I think that we should be making policy decisions based on real data. I think that we should have the ability to model, to visualize what happens if we close a border, what happens if we build a wall, physical or virtual, what happens if weather makes a channel impassable. I think that we need to do a better job of modeling these things. There's been an innovation gap in this space for far too long. And I love that we're all here because we're filling that gap. Mm-hmm. So policy also, ultimately what we started, at the heart of this project was creating more options for civilians in conflict. So really being able to offer more solutions to people that need a safe way out. That's what has been at the foundation of this all along, and I think that's always what we'll be focused on.
Uh-huh.
I guess this is going to be a comment cleverly disguised as a question. Regarding small enterprises and social enterprises, there's a lot of pressure to share data as a business model, and I guess I'd be seeking advice as to how we can do that in a way that isn't identifiable, whether it's zip code or postcode or higher, no more identifiable than a local postcode. Because I work in a social enterprise and I find that that's almost exclusively how we're told to think about as a business model, is to share that data. And how do we do that when we don't want to share people's information? And is it actually necessary to collect data that's specific, or are we just doing it because we're expected to?
Who puts pressure for you to share data?
I think anytime you go to a pitch event or any sort of investor, the expectation is that if you're a social enterprise and you're not likely to generate your own income or revenue stream, the expectation is the data you collect, as in my case an mHealth application, is going to be the only sort of valuable, financial return on investment as opposed to a social return on investment.
So I think they're interested in the insights that your data contain. But in short, I think you should not share your data. And that I think the model of the future is one where, as I try to explain, you can provide access, controlled access to your data to trusted third parties through a trusted privacy preserving system. But you should not share and therefore expose sensitive data.
And really quick, just to follow on that, that's essentially one of the things we did, right? So we have all this data. We built an interface to allow potentially interested people to actually query the data set through our tool and derive insights, but without actually giving them the raw data themselves.
I build AI for commercial applications, and I haven't generally been allowed to do it unless there's some intervention that can be taken. So I'm interested. I think your technology sounds amazing. Is it that precise and that real time that it can be actioned? For Emmanuel, I'm really interested in how does this work operationally? We're not to build data lakes. We're not to remove the data from institutions that are responsible for it. Like I would have been kind of working we'll have some API where we strip out PII and we do build a data lake, but we have to develop relationships individually with these institutions too.
The idea behind the system that we created is that it is actionable, and our internal statistics indicate about an 8-minute average amount of warning given to someone in order for them to take self-protective action before there's a kinetic event. I think that for us, we kind of want to move into the space of forewarning kind of further out events, so a flare-up of violence, intercommunal violence between refugees and host communities and things like that. But I think the idea is that the things that we're most interested in are actionable. We think that's where we can add the most value.
I just came back this morning from Dubai, where there was the UN World Data Forum these past 3 days, and we did the first like live demo of OPAL. So it will be on the website. It's like opalproject.com, but and it's a non-profit, so I'm not selling stuff. So in short, yes. So it's an API. We've had to build to sign a contract with Orange, Sonatel in Senegal, and with Telefonica in Colombia. We have access directly. We have a server behind their firewalls where 2 and 3 years of data of CDRs. Where we sort of like logged 3 years of data, and the algorithms, the open algorithms, run directly on the servers, and then it's only the indicators that are extracted and made available. So it's a query, question and answer system. And we did a live demo where you send a query. I mean, the UI is not very user friendly. It's for like pretty good data scientists. But it's the first time ever that such a system exists, has been built, where you can, so it's not one single operator, it's not Facebook that is providing your data, so it can be replicated to any private sector data. And I think it will in the next couple of years. And then in closing, my goal, sort of like vision, is actually we talk about AI, is to sort of create a human AI where we apply the key principles of artificial intelligence, so the feedback loops, the role of data, the credit assignment function in understanding what are the nodes and what are the kinds of actions, behaviors, etc., that help you reach a certain objective, which can be the Sustainable Development Goals or greater equality. And then you can actually, through data, learning, and feedback loop, as a social system, actually understand what are the policies, actions, etc., that should be strengthened, and those that should not be strengthened.
Lots of poorly funded or early stage social enterprises and charities, and even the better funded ones who are maybe not super savvy when it comes to cybersecurity and so on, are storing data on vulnerable individuals all over the place. So they've got some in Google Docs, some in Excel, some in email. It's all over the shop, and could, in theory, be compromised, which could be very, very bad for those vulnerable people. Do you have any tips for those organizations in terms of best practice and how they could get started in terms of securing the data of those people that they're working with?
So I can answer quickly. So in Dubai, I had a discussion with people from UNHCR, and they had the same question. They say, we're pretty, and I'm not, this is public, they say, we're pretty old, so how should our databases be organized? And first there is a question of organization, how digitization, etc. And then there's a question of protection. So so of course there are techniques like encryption, which are going to become sort of standard, and in the next data systems, all the data will be encrypted at all times. But that's costly, and it takes a lot of need resources and knowledge, etc. But that's clearly the path. And then there are need to add layers of security around the data. And then again, I'm going to go back to like this like open algorithms model, where there's a lot of insights still that are like in those data sets. So I don't think the answer is not to collect data or to not collect data. There are rules about data and minimization that I think should be like upheld. Maybe you don't need to collect all data. Maybe you need to destroy data after, or some data. You can create features, and only those features get stored for past N years. So also because servers are extremely energy hungry, so it also gets into like the sort of the sustainability from an environmental standpoint. But those are the kinds of like, yeah, let's say like just pointers and like long-term tools and vision.
So I actually thought you were going to go in a different direction with that question. So I'm going to pretend that you asked what I thought you were going to ask, which is something I think is important to address, and that is poorly funded organizations and how can they work with organizations like ours, because AI systems are expensive, and so this idea of strategic partnership and finding creative ways to work together, I just cannot emphasize enough how important that is. And I can say that I think it's a, I think misconception is probably too strong of a word, because certainly there are, it can get expensive, but there are also opportunities, I think, to partner together. And I think there's an appetite, at least I can speak for, just myself and my project, right? That, we're working again with the Danish Refugee Council. And so, where there's a will, there's a way. I often describe myself as an advocate for refugees who happens to work at IBM. And I think a lot of times smaller organizations or NGOs get scared off when they hear things like AI or machine learning, because they think that they can't afford it. But when we talk about building a proof of concept, right, or a prototype for a different use case, I mean, there are opportunities to collaborate, and I think we need to do more of that. So if anybody wants to talk later about a partnership, come find me.
And John, final word with you.
Just finally, and going back to the other interpretation of your question, I think that the softest threat vector for any organization is human beings, and so there are lots of tools that are very free, like two-factor authentication, that allow you to harden the most common threat vectors. And I would start there before you got into a lot of fancy other stuff. Make sure people don't click on links, and email would be a really good start for most organizations.
Thank you very much to the three of you. Thank you very much for your questions and a return on experience. And I'll let the stage and the mic to Mike, basically.